Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Everydayers, we're going to be back tomorrow with our crossover preview of Game 3 with the guys from Locked On Knicks. We have our Madison Square Garden celebrity draft in a minute, but first, with the series going back to Miami, tied 1-1. What's one thing the Heat need to do better in Game 3? Jeremy, start with you.
This is a funny question.
It's
To
funny.
get Jimmy Butler back.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
No, I mean, it seems that's the part that was funny is like if Jimmy
Yes.
Butler's back, it solves a whole lot of the issues that we saw for the Heat, in that game. Realistically, the Heat played really well in game 2. I think they played better than any of us anticipated that they would. They shot the ball pretty well. I was really impressed by the play of Caleb Martin and Gabe Vincent throughout that game, particularly down the stretch. I thought they did a pretty good job on defense, particularly considering how much zone defense they needed to play. I think that the likelihood is that we won't see as much zone in Game 3, in part because Jimmy Butler will be back, and I think that mixing. I'm intrigued to see the way that the Heat defend this team because they gave them an opportunity to shoot. And realistically, I think the Knicks are far closer to what we saw in Game 1 shooting the basketball than they were in Game 2, especially because we would have been having that same conversation had they not hit just a few huge ones down the stretch, right? Josh Hart hit threes after like airballing threes in Game 1. They don't exactly have a ton of consistency from deep. And, it was funny. Julius Randle almost hurt them a bunch of different times and like trying to do too much. So I am intrigued to see like when it's in the Heat's arena, and when the momentum is there from a Heat crowd as opposed to a Knicks crowd, how that changes like his style of play as well. Is he almost actually a little more under control? Because it felt like he was feeding so much off the energy that he was just wiling out. But realistically, like it's hard to think of much that the Heat can do better outside of just really rebounding the basketball
And
right?
getting Jimmy back. Yeah.
And getting Jimmy back.
And the rebounding the ball thing is also a point to the zone. And I have a couple things on the zone, but just a quick note on Jimmy Butler. Expectations are that he will be back for Game 3.
Right.
And actually the swelling and the sprain in that right ankle is not as bad as initially the team feared. So all good news, expectations, everything trending towards Jimmy Butler playing in Game 3. In terms of that zone, the Heat gave up 31 points to the Knicks on like 23 or 24 possessions in that first quarter. That was bad defense by the Heat in the first quarter. And they were mostly playing man-to-man. So then they switched to zone for the rest of the game. And it worked. It worked for
great.
2 quarters. It worked in the second quarter when they limited the Knicks to 20 points, 25 points for the Knicks in the third quarter. And then Jalen Brunson basically just figured it out. He cracked the code, and he scored 10 points in the fourth quarter. The Knicks had 35 points in the fourth quarter. And obviously that game went from an 8-point lead for the Heat into a loss. And so you don't want to make too much of it, but you also want to kind of respect the fact that Jalen Brunson cracked your code to your 1-1-3 zone and your 2-3 zone. They had a couple different looks at it. And so you can't really go back to that well. But to your point, Jeremy, like the Heat aren't going to do that if Jimmy Butler is available. They played more zone this year, not because they're like super in love with the zone, but because they had more games missed due to injury than any other team in the NBA. Correct. And when they're backed into a corner, they go to the zone because they had to, not because once they were healthy, they stopped playing zone, right? Mm-hmm. They don't want to play zone. And then when you're in zone, also, you're not really defending a body, you're defending space. So when the ball goes up, you're not always near a body to box out. And then that's why the rebounding advantage is the way it is. But also a tip to the cap to the Knicks. They're an awesome rebounding team. The Heat are an okay rebounding team.
Right.
They're probably going to have the advantage going forward. You just don't want it to be as big of a gap as it was. And if you're playing less zone, chances are that's going to be the case. So getting Jimmy back, playing less zone. David, what's one thing that the Heat have to do to win Game 3?
Well, kind of Jeremy's point, it's basically a cascade effect. Jimmy's return makes all the difference. But for me, one thing that really stood out was the lack of three-point shooting from Miami's bench. They really just didn't get a lot of support from beyond the perimeter. A lot of that's also solved by moving Caleb Martin back into the backup rotation. He was 4 of 8 from 3. If Jimmy's starting and he's coming off the bench, that solves a lot of it. But without Caleb and he was in the starting lineup obviously because of Jimmy's loss there. Then you're going 4 of 14 from 3-point range. That's not good enough. You've got to be able to come in there, provide a little bit of support. Duncan Robinson struggled. Kyle Lowry struggled. I think Lowry in particular was a little bit more egregious of the two.
4 from 3-point range, right?
Yeah. He was such a boost in Game 1, and you were hoping that at least his experience and leadership. You know, we've talked about Bam, and certainly he deserves some criticism, although maybe not as pointed as has been. But I think Kyle Lowry didn't do quite enough either. So he had a couple moments there where he could have really swung the game in Miami's favor, and unfortunately he did not come up big in those opportunities. So that's it basically. Just, you know, getting a little bit more support from your bench, but of course none of that really matters if Jimmy's out there and playing the kind of game that we've seen from him throughout the postseason.
Jimmy, you're passionate about South Florida sports fans. You mentioned the Knicks fans at Madison Square Garden. David and I have talked about it a lot. My theory on all of this was, and has been and still is, there is no home court advantage for the Knicks when they're playing the Heat, and there's no home court advantage really for the Heat when they're playing the Knicks. Both of these fan bases share stadiums just like they share cities. You go to these games at Madison Square Garden, you're going to hear Let's Go Heat chants. I did that. I was at Madison Square Garden in February for the Heat Knicks game, and I heard Let's Go Heat chants. We heard them through the broadcast during the first two games, and then you hear the same stuff in Miami when they're playing the Knicks. So, but in general, why do you think that Heat fans, South Florida sports fans in general, get such a bad rap, and do they deserve it?
I don't think that South Florida sports fans deserve the bad rap that they get. Miami/South Florida is a really strange place to have sports in terms of like the other options, right? So like we look at LA fans and nobody views them as fickle. And yet, you know, constantly we see sort of the same sort of laissez-faire type of fandom out there. And you look at New York and you have a specific type of like aggressive fan. And what's interesting is Miami is essentially, in a lot of ways, culturally a hybrid of those two cities. And it creates a really interesting place where we have both that sort of like upper class, like, you know, rich folk showing up to games late sort of mentality, and also the like working class, really, really, really passionate fan. And I actually think that both sets of those fans are equally passionate, just in their different approaches. The reason that I think a lot of people sort of don't understand Miami fandom is, number one, like just culturally, it's different. For each sport, it's different. And so I do think that, like, you know, people will throw Marlins attendance numbers at Heat fans. And it's like, it really is it's not a separate fan base because they bleed together in some ways, but like it is a separate event. And I think that's sort of the difference, is like sports are grouped in with the events in Miami in a way that is different from a lot of other cities. And so if you can prove that your sporting event will be an event, people will show up. Look at what's going on with the Panthers in their attendance in the last couple of years, because they're putting on a show. I truly believe, like, I've been someone from the beginning, if the Marlins have a consistent winner, people are going to show up, and I believe that. I don't care where the stadium is. I don't care what the relationship has been before. That is where people will rag on Miami sports fans, is like, oh, you only support a winner. That's not necessarily true. Like, Heat fans, basically since they won 20 years ago or 15 years ago, however we want to refer to it, split the difference, they've been showing up even when the Heat aren't all that good. Going to a game became an event. It became an event even more so when the Big Three was here. And since then, like, no matter whether the Heat have been in one of those weird 10-31 stretches, or they've been great, you know, fans have shown up. And I think that, like, the passion is so specific. You guys see Heat Twitter. It's different from a lot of other fan bases, I think, just in that there's also these like funky expectations of success. And because all of the sports teams fan bases are sort of sometimes at each other's throats, there's this weird sort of dynamic of like this cult-like following of the way your organization does it too, right? And the way we, you know, everybody reveres Pat Riley as they should, as the Godfather, and like this fascinating obsession with the way that the organizations are run too. Like, I can't imagine that there's a lot of areas in the country that have as many fans obsessing over the NBA draft and free agency and the NFL draft and, you know, the mechanisms of arbitration in baseball and, you know, major trades in the NHL. Like, it's an equally passionate fan base to any I've seen. And I've been in the building now for enough moments at all of these different stadiums, and I know, like, these people care. Like, these people care. It's our jobs to know, you know, what these fan bases are like and what they're thinking. Heck, I've been a part of it. Like, I grew up rooting for all of these teams. I know. Like, I can see it. I know the way that these teams have made me feel and what the relationships are like and what it's like in middle school or high school when the Heat come home with a championship, like,
yeah. And when these teams are all relatively young compared to the other teams in their leagues, and
exactly,
and to the point of South Florida sports fans only follow winners. Well, isn't that sort of sports? Like, you're going to have ride or die guys, but like the reason sports teams try to win because they get revenue share in the NBA, for instance. The only reason owners want to put on a winning product is A, just pure ego, and then B, which would be kind of the Mark Cuban and Joe Lacob thing, and then B is to make money, and that's probably that should probably be A. Like, you win in order to make money, right? You make more money to go to the playoffs, you make more money if you have all-stars, more money with sponsorships, more money if you go to the finals, all that stuff. So you're supposed to want to win. So I don't understand why that's a knock against the Heat fan base, the South Florida fan, or any fan base. You drew an interesting corollary to the LA market, and that to me is the most similar one. And people say, well, LA, they sell out everything. You go to a Dodgers game, they're sold out, blah, 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 blah. You know what the population of Los Angeles is? 4 million people.
Right.
You know what the population of Miami is? 2023 census? 400,000.
That's what people don't seem to understand at all.
That's ridiculous, though, from somebody who...
census?
No, the census is ridiculous. It's always it's largely inaccurate. Right. But the problem is that we're looking at Miami as a metropolitan area.
Right, throw in Broward, throw in Fort Lauderdale, throw it all in.
There's 33 different municipalities in Miami-Dade County, so you have to look at the population of Miami. Miami-Dade County, in general, I think it's larger than Los Angeles. And population-wise, I'm not saying that I'm not disputing what you and Jeremy are saying. I agree with you. It
sounds like it because I thought my census point was really good, and then you came in with a census
really
data
undermined it.
Check.
Yeah,
like,
you really undermined
sorry.
I didn't realize I was on CNN.
Yeah, what is this?
Whatever.
Choose
your own stats. Yeah.
I looked up census data while Jeremy was talking.
Analytics.
I was like, boom, here we go. We're off the races.
Back to your mom's basement, you geek. You're ruining the game. Go use your eye test numbers elsewhere. I guess I'm all over.
I will say it is just to wrap it together, because I do think, just to try to help you on your census point, is getting to these stadiums and arenas are different, right? It's not, there are certain cities where it's like,
no, Miami-Dade County infrastructure sucks.
That's a second part of it, right? Is that the infrastructure is not.
I have parking data from the census too that I saw this morning, but I'm not even going to bother bringing that up. So.
No, you don't. You do.
I do. Yeah.
What? Oh, really?
2% fewer parking spots more than any other on average versus other major cities. We have 2% fewer parking spots. Wow. It sounds a lot, but when you're talking about a major city, that's a lot. It does add up. So
good for you.
Got no pushback on that. Oh, good point, Wes. Very good. We'll end on that.